All right, we are live. I'm shocked Matthew McConaughey. I didn't know Matthew McConaughey is married, but I guess
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, it has been a while. He was shooting a film in Cleveland, which is why I was there.
What film was it? What did it turn out to
I
be?
have no idea. I mean, I'd have to, this would have been, gosh, how many years ago? 5 years ago? 4 years ago? I don't know. I'd have to go look.
As a proud alumni at the University of Texas, I'm always upset during football games they flash to him like he's the mascot. I'm like,
Um,
stop giving him so much camera time. Like, or at least like they're kind of ushering in Glenn Powell now, which I'm like, Glenn Powell to me is a little more palatable, a little more age appropriate. But we got a lot of distinguished alumni that aren't Matthew McConaughey going, all right, all right, all right on the sideline. Anyways, don't
he's
get
he's the
fired.
one they always show. You're right. I mean, he gets so much. Too funny. Hmm.
Who's Ohio State have? The
Who's
big
up? What's that?
We said, who's Ohio State have? The big nut?
You know who they always show is LeBron.
Oh,
LeBron,
Yeah,
who
right.
didn't go to Ohio State, but
Right.
he always says if he would have went to college, that's where he would have went. So he's the one. Zeke Elliott's at a lot of games. He's one of the alum that seems to come back for a lot of big games. But I think a lot of the Buckeye alum come back for games on their bye weeks and when they're able. But LeBron and the three idiot fans, Big Nut, and those are the ones they always show. So, but
there you go.
yeah. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into it. This is the big picture presented by our friends and sponsors at Depth. 20 years of very ably serving the residential lending and fintech spaces, public relations, brand management, strategic communication. If you need your story told, do it with the fine people at Depth. They are great and many, many happy clients that we can connect you with if you want to learn a little bit more. So
I
thanks.
I gotta say, or if you want to go for a hike in Georgia,
Oh,
I
yeah.
was down there this weekend with Carrie Milam, and we went up on Stone Mountain. Uh, I don't think there's racial connotations at that place like there used to be, but we went for this awesome hike, and you can see all of Atlanta, and so if you need a hiking partner there too, Depth has you covered. Good people all around.
That's a full service firm. That's right. You went on the hike with Carrie. You told me about that. So how was it? It had to be fun, right?
It was good. She she's a good sport. I think she's more than twice my age, but she charged up that thing. So
She
good for her.
was you. All right, that's good to hear. All right. Well, big ups to Carrie and Depth, and then thank you for your partnership and sponsorship in the show. So. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. I'm Rich Swerbinsky with Onward and Upward Consulting, and this week joined. Rob is in flight midair right now, so Rob's son Robbie joining us today. Robbie on Manhattan Island today. Robbie, good to see you.
Good to see. My dad has no faith in airlines. He was surprised that his flight was on time, which I don't have trouble with airlines like he does for some reason. But
He
happy to
seems
be
to
here.
have,
Thanks for coming.
he seems to have a lot of problems. Going back to the earlier days of this show, the drug dog incidents in the airport. It was some of the highlights of the early days of this show under a different name. So. And this week, really, really pleased to be joined once again by a special guest. And I'm now calling you a regular contributor to the show, Jim, which thank you for that, by the way. It is the co-owner of Parrott Ryan Advisors, non-resident uh, fellow at the Urban Institute and former senior housing policy advisor for President Obama. It is Jim Parrott. Jim, great to see you, and thanks for making time for us once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Nothing to talk about, in the world
Yeah.
of politics.
All placid, tranquil, nothing to see here.
Well, I'll start with both of you guys. Did anybody get a chance to watch the John McKernan and Bill Pulte nomination hearings today?
Yeah, I watched most of it. The tape ran out at like
Yeah,
hour and
same happened to
45
me.
minutes.
Yeah, it just cut
So
off. It was getting kind of heated at the point it cut off too.
yeah, I'm not sure. I couldn't tell how far through the committee they'd gotten. I mean, the big dogs had all gone. Warren and those guys had all gone. But yeah, I don't know. I'll have to reach out and figure out what happened to the other end of the tape and whether or not any dramatic, whether we missed anything. But of course, if it happened and nobody could see it, did it really happen? I don't know. Maybe not.
Robbie, did that make your to-do list today? The McKernan and the Pulte hearings?
Unfortunately, no.
I don't know. So, but yeah, I
C-SPAN
did get.
is that where I find it? C-SPAN? Is that the spot?
YouTube, you'd find it. The Senate Banking Committee website. Although the Senate Banking Committee website's the one that's cut at 149 or something. Maybe they fixed it. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I watched most of it. It was as contentious as I guess I thought it would be. But Jim, any thoughts on the, you've been through a lot of these and battle scars to prove it. Any thoughts on the goings down?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty predictable in the sense that you knew, given what's happened at the CFPB, that McKernan was going to take most of the heat and questions, and that the questions would be about, whether or not the building should still stand, less about how he would run it. And it puts him in a tough spot because, he's being asked to run a building that, at least on the outside, looks like it's being shut down. And Trump said some pretty, rough things about. And so they kept asking, not surprisingly, do you agree with the guy that nominated you that the building you're about to run is terrible and should be shut down? And like, what are you supposed to say when you're the nominee for the building that the president says is supposed to be shut down? So Jonathan, to his credit, I think got himself out of a bunch of pretty tough corners. And then Pulte's got to have loved it. I mean, he didn't, they asked him 5 questions.
Mhm.
What's your favorite food? And, the sky blue, and that was about it. So, and I think nobody even noticed the poor CA guy get nominated, much less the commerce guy. So, but it was all kind of predictable. I mean, if the strategy back in the Obama years, when you would have someone going up for a hearing that was going to be controversial, like HAMP was always the thing that was controversial, and we knew that whoever's running HAMP would get their rear ends kicked by the committee. And the R's, were running. It was like Henschling and those guys back in that day, and you knew they were going to yell at whoever's running HAMP. And so we would always, when we would agree to do the hearing, we'd say, yeah, we'll send them up, but you got to have these other 4 people too. So we'd have this like, this giant block of people there who always chime in and answer over whoever was running HAMP, just to minimize the amount of time that you'd spend yelling at the person that you knew was going to take all the heat. And so you want to distribute that attention as broadly as you can if you're the Trump folks, and they did. So I think they came off by and large okay. I didn't see anything that change or trajectory of any of these guys, probabilities. We should, at some point, we should talk about the CPB because that's an interesting policy political conundrum that will matter. How it plays out will matter to the industry for sure.
Yeah, the poor commerce guy and the other guy, they barely got any questions. Paul T, to your point, got like 5 or 6 that were pretty easy.
But you don't want them. It's not like
I
it's not
know.
like if
Yeah.
you've got to do well to get over it. It's a little like being stopped by a cop. You don't want like a long conversation. You just want it to be really clean, simple, and done.
Can
So
only be
if you're
bad.
gonna
The
have a
outcomes
hearing,
of speaking.
you want your 2 questions, and then you just want to sit there and watch somebody else get yelled at like that. If that's what you can do, like the CA guy is ecstatic. The fact that he didn't have to answer any questions means that he didn't screw up and he doesn't have a problem. Same with the commerce guy. So success is everybody forgetting who you are after the course of an hour and 45 minutes. So.
Right. Yeah, McKernan, I was impressed by McKernan. I thought, he was in kind of a tough spot. And yeah, to your point, I think he handled the questions well. And yeah, I mean, he kind of just stuck to the, hey, listen, I'm gonna follow the law. I'm gonna, he really, he was married to a few kind of salient talking points and opined a couple times. But all in all, I thought yeah, to your point, I think he handled himself pretty well and didn't hurt his nomination chances. So. Well, let's get into that part of it. Of course, John McKernan being nominated as the new director of the CFPB, an organization that has been in the news for the last couple of weeks here. And Jim, would just, yeah, I'd love to get your, I guess, general thoughts to start on just, everything that's happened with the CFPB. What we should make of it as far as our listeners and those of us in the mortgage industry, and then how you really kind of see things playing out from here forward with the Bureau and all that. So
Yeah, so let me start like big picture around all of the aggressive moves made on agencies generally, particularly the CFPB, and then I'll leg into the how to think about where all this is going with the CFPB, which is pretty uncertain. The Trump folks have been, as you guys know, pretty aggressive in freezing funding through the entire government. The courts have sort of slowed that down a little bit, but they at least have tried, they've moved to fire or lay off, enormous segments of various buildings. And they've largely shut down the CFPB until further notice, as it were. Literally sent an email to the staff and said, don't come back into work. Do not, send or receive emails on our accounts. Put your pens down, all of that. I mean, a full on, you're done. And they've done that. I mean, the CFPB is the most extreme example in the space that we care about. But, there are rumors that they're going to do something not quite similar at FHA and Ginnie, but at very least, lay off half their staffs in both cases. And so the challenge in the housing space is at some point moves that dramatic are going to bump up against just the normal industry's ability to function as an industry. And CFPB posed a nice example. So when they went into the CFPB like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, and told everybody to drop their pens, the staff pointed out that there's a whole lot of data that the CFPB is supposed to collect and publish in order for the industry to do what industry needs to do. And one example is APOR. So as your lenders know, in order to make a QM compliant loan, it's got to fall within a certain spread over APOR, this prime lending figure. Well, CFPB publishes APOR every week. Every Friday, they go and collect data from a third-party vendor. They publish a bunch of tables that shows you what you got to do if you're a lender to fall within QM. That's part of CFPB's job. And so when the staff guys went into leadership and said, hey, we really ought to get these numbers up, by Friday. Otherwise, people aren't going to know, what loans they're supposed to make in order to fall within the legal safeguard of QM. And so luckily the new leadership kind of relented and said, all right, well, you guys can go and do that. And so they said, all right, so they geared back up the machinery to report the numbers, and they found that all their third-party contracts had been canceled. Mm-hmm. So the data collector for APOR was like, look, guys, sorry, but you fired us, like 24 hours ago. So they go back to leadership again. They got leadership to sort of reverse that. They go back to get it all set up. Well, the internet service providers' contracts have been shut down. So they had no way to get the data from the service provider, into CFPB. They, figured all that out. The clock, meanwhile, is it's like Wednesday, Thursday, and they eventually get it all done in time to actually post numbers. But it's a reminder that if your approach to shrinking the government is, taking a hammer to all these buildings, at some point you're going to break something that the industry is going to care about, and it's going to be a problem. Another rumor that's been swirling just today, which takes you out of the CFPB bucket, but it still will matter to your audience. The latest rumor is that in part of the FHA's cuts, part of HUD's cuts, they're going to shut down the National Servicing Center in Oklahoma City. And that's where like most of the FHA servicing, like back office stuff happens. So if you're a lender and you've got to get, FHA approval on a loan mod, your phone call goes into that building in Oklahoma City. And so if those folks aren't there anymore, it's not quite clear how that's supposed to work. Maybe, it's an oversight. They didn't quite realize what they were doing. Maybe they'll reverse it. Maybe those people will go work somewhere else. But again, you're bringing a hammer to a bunch of institutional stuff that we actually need to have, happen. So that there's a lot of that going on, which is just worth people keeping an eye on, because at some point, if they keep wielding the hammer, they're going to break something that actually matters to folks. But on CFPB, more generally, there's like a really interesting tension going on in the Trump world, the resolution of which will determine how the CFPB operates for industry going forward. There's a crowd that just hates the existence of the CFPB. They can't stand its independence. They can't stand that it's funded by the Fed, not through an appropriation, that it seems out to get industry and so forth. And they'd love to just burn the place down. They'd love to have it deleted and all the rest. Musk is kind of in that camp, but Russ Vought, who's the acting CFPB director at the moment, because he's OMB director, he's very much in that camp. It just drives some bananas that CFPB even exists at all. But then there's another camp within the Republican Party generally that has some sway in the Trump administration that just wants to see the thing reined in, that thinks that, you know, the industry needs a referee of some kind. Otherwise, you got bad actors who are going to run all over the place. They get a market advantage, and it's not good for anybody that's not a bad actor. They also publish a bunch of stuff that you need to have to make the market work, like APOR. And so there's a lot of stuff they do that's actually really useful, even from an industry perspective. And so there's a group that thinks that you just got to get them to play by a narrower set of rules, be more transparent, be a little more inclusive with industry and how they do rulemaking, and then they're actually helpful, not hurtful. So there's this like tension between these two camps in Trump land. And what's interesting about that is right now, the burn it down crowd very much runs CFPB. That's why the doors are shut and nobody's allowed to do anything. But McKernan's very much in the rein it in camp. That guy didn't want to burn it down. He, you know, wouldn't have taken the job if he's wants to burn it down. He wants to make it work better. You heard him in his testimony today, where he talked about what that meant. You know, that means he had this nice analogy or metaphor or whatever when pushed by Warner, I think. And he said, look, or something along the lines of, you know, if you're watching a basketball game, if the next day all everybody's talking about is the referee, then the referee didn't do a good job. Like, you know, if the referee's done a good job, then we forgot he existed, right? It means that he imposed the rules in the way that should be imposed. They were clear. Folks got to play the game in the way they should be played. The referee was sort of, you know, invisible, as it were. Like, effectively, that's what a conservative CFPB like should be like. They should be an institution where the rules of the road are clear, bad actors get nailed enough so that people quit doing bad stuff, and you know, the game is fair, and consumers have access to fair, balanced markets that are open and liquid and all the rest. And like, that's what a conservative CFPB is kind of supposed to be all about, and kind of what McKernan, I think, would drive it towards. And so the big question is going to be whether or not, if he gets in, is he given the flexibility and resources, you know, from the White House to actually do it? Because you need staff, you need resources and whatever to be a good referee in that space. If you shut the whole thing down, it's not as if, you know, the industry's better off. It ends up that the industry doesn't have a referee at all, and nobody wants to play ball in a court, you know, with no referee at all. So does that make sense? It's sort of a long-winded kind of.
No, I think that was outstanding. Just synopsis of the whole situation. Thanks, Jim. Robbie, what's your sense of where the mortgage industry as a whole is at with burn it down versus maybe just a little less politics, a little less gotcha, but we still, you know, need a referee? What's your sense of like the 50-50? Like, where do you think that's at?
Switching the question a little bit, because following what Mr. Parrott just said would have been a tough act there. So Jim, yes, I thought that was excellent as well. My thought in traveling around and speaking with people is, you look at these companies that have spent millions and millions of dollars on compliance departments, on you know, being compliant with whatever regulations are out there. And I don't think the industry necessarily wants more or a lot less regulation. They just want better regulation. And so this uncertainty, whether it's, you know, uncertainty in general in the mortgage industry is no good. Whether it's what's going to happen with rates, whether it's what's going to happen with the regulatory environment, whatever it might be, not good. And so you would think, you know, my mind goes to a couple places. There might be some short-term wins for some people. Like today, I think that, you know, CFPB or the U.S. District Court in Detroit ruled that, the CFPB notified the district court in Detroit that it wasn't going to keep pursuing litigation against the Jason Mitchell Group or rocket companies and all that. So there's some short-term wins for sure. But the thought would be, you know, one, if companies are going to start breaking rules now and thinking there's no oversight, well, you can have oversight later that punishes you for things done now. So this kind of interim void isn't really a benefit to anybody. And then the other thing that keeps coming up is, you know, if the CFPB wants to turn it back over to a state's rights, and you can have 50 different state regulators going at this, and companies that do business in all 50 states, you're going to have to deal with all those different regulators. You know, it's regulation is good. And I'll loop back to what I said at the start, which is we just need better regulation. You know, we could have less. I'm fine with less, but like, make it clear and make it something that companies can follow. It's something that I think is necessary. And so this, you know, much like Jim said, if you start taking a hammer to things, something's inevitably going to break. And yes, the Trump administration 2.0 wants much smaller bureaucracy, and they're going about it in a pretty drastic manner. There's going to be things that break unintentionally, and I hope for the sake of our industry that this interim period of uncertainty, you know, it's bad actors can't come to the forefront and make meaningful, lasting harm. That's where my head goes with it.
One other thing that follow up on what you said, which is worth like emphasizing, and you said it, but I want to flesh it out a little. It's important to know that even if you were to practically shut CFPB down, you can't shut it down without legislation because it's been created by Dodd-Frank. But even if you were to defund it, so it basically doesn't do anything, the laws that it's in place to enforce don't go away. You don't magically erase all the rules of the road. It just means that now 50 state AGs are going to enforce them. And a lot of the laws bring private rights of action. So you're going to plaintiffs' attorneys. So you kind of got a choice. You can either have one regulator kind of own the field, as it were, in a way that is clear and transparent, and that where industry has some say in like how the rules get written, that owns the field and defines what the rules of the road are going to be. Or that those guys get off the field altogether, and you'll have like whatever hodgepodge of enforcers you've got across 50 states and Lord knows how many plaintiffs' attorneys that will fill the vacuum. So it's not, no one should be under the impression that when you burn the CFPB down, you're burning down all these rules with them. You know, all you're doing is turning the implementation of those rules over to a lot of other folks, which I can't imagine why anybody would actually prefer that outcome. I can imagine that we might like bumble into it, not fully appreciating what we're doing and thinking we're accomplishing some sort of streamlining by having CFPB not around anymore, when in fact, that's not going to be the outcome. So it's worth remembering as folks get their bees in a bonnet over CFPB, what the outcome of defunding it would actually be.
Yeah, I mean, I got a couple of clients that do a lot of lending in New York and California, obviously two of the bluer states, and they don't want the CFPB to go away because they're terrified of what their state regulators will do if, you know, in the void of, or, you know, or a severely weakened CFPB. And yeah, to your point, it then becomes kind of state by state regulators and states that are angered and feel like there's risk to the CFPB being weakened could come in and put in place things even more penal. And yeah, and it's, you know, it's like every lender class, I think, has a different purview on it, like the banks and the credit unions. I was at lunch with a very good friend of mine that runs lending for a bank that they're like 12 billion in assets. So they're just over the 10 billion. So they are under the CFPB purview. And he was like, I mean, the amount of money that they're going to save. He's like, we're already regulated by two different banking organizations. You know, we have regulators in 6 different times a year. He's like, for us, it really has no impact on our customers, and you know, it's going to save us. You know, so community bank. So I think the depositories, you know, would just rather see it be gone. And then, but the independent mortgage banks, like I think the vast majority of like small to medium sized independent mortgage bankers, especially with all the consolidation we've seen in the industry the last few years, you know, they want the CFPB, I think, to continue to exist, is my sense. So, but
Yeah, Rich, I was listening to Bloomberg Radio this morning, and they were talking about how, you know, some of these cases that are going to be coming up in front of the Supreme Court, notably like the last one that really influenced presidential power, Monroe versus Madison, a ways back. We're dealing with a much smaller government. We had a comment in the chat about bureaucracy. Jim, I want your take on, like, bureaucracy has grown so much and the government has grown so much. Do you think the Constitution is as applicable today? Do you think we need a drastic reshuffling in some senses based on how large government has gotten? To set as politics aside as much as you can, just talk about the overall.
Yes. So let me talk about what they're actually trying to do, which is interesting, gets right to that, I think. And this will help connect some of the dots of what's actually happening right now, it's not obvious how they connect, so it seems very chaotic, but the Trump guys have a strategy and a vision for all this that goes to exactly this point. They have a very strong view on your question, which is why I'll walk through it. So if you put the pieces on the table, freezing funding for government agencies, firing, you know, half of a lot of these the folks in these buildings, at least that's what they're trying to do, all of which is kind of gummed up in the courts, but we'll see where it goes. But anyway, those two opening bids, they have ignored what's called the Impoundment Control Act, which is an act put in place by Congress that requires the president to spend money that Congress appropriates. So when you're freezing all these funds at the different agencies, you're basically telling them not to spend money that Congress is giving them to spend, which is in violation of this law, which I'll come back to. They've done this intentionally. That's taking power away from Congress and giving it to the executive branch. And then they've taken all of the so-called independent agencies, and by executive order, they're now forcing them to report up through OMB. So every independent agency, OCC, FDIC, the whole alphabet soup, they're supposed to be independent, running through their own boards. They're now running through OMB. The one exception is the Fed's monetary policy. They carved that out and said that stays independent. But even the Fed, their regulatory policy now flows through OMB. So there is underway this massive effort to restructure the way government works to make it a much smaller, much more executive branch driven, White House driven organization. It'll function, if they pull it off, it'll function much more like the British system, where you've got, a single group that's in power that when they decide something happens, it gets implemented, as opposed to the more unwieldy sort of process that we've had forever, where you've got all these different checks in place that slows everything down. So if they pull this off, you're going to wind up with a government that is much smaller, feels much more like a pre-FDR kind of government, that does much less, that is probably more nimble in certain respects, where the welfare state we've sort of all gotten used to, whether one likes it or not, likely, at least under Republican administrations, is much smaller, because they'll be able to decide, which stuff to continue to spend on and what stuff not to spend on. So I think what they're navigating to answer your question on the Trump team's behalf, is a much smaller government structure. And there are benefits to that and there are costs to that. In the housing space, what makes me a little nervous about it, though, is the current housing finance system we've got in this country has a giant role for the government, whether folks like it or not. The government footprint, the government guarantees sitting behind the market is enormous, right? The segments of the market that don't have a government guarantee is infinitesimally small these days compared to the way it was, even 20 years ago, pre-crisis. The PLS market's teeny, warehouse lending's, quite small. The IMBs running through to REITs, that's the meat of the channel in some ways. And so if you're beginning to talk about shrinking the government's role in the economy generally, then there's a good chance that the housing market gets swept up in all that. And we're talking about shrinking the government's role in the housing space. And that's just a very different model than the one we have today. And what you've heard in the past, some folks arguing that we should shrink the government's footprint in the housing space, quite significantly. But I think before folks get all worked up about what feels good about that, at least philosophically, it's just worth remembering how far that is from the world we have today. Like, we're not in a world where, I don't think, maybe you guys and your viewers would think differently, we're not in a world where if IMBs were forced to pull back by 30%, we can just assume that the depositories are going to lean in by 30% and we'll all be fine. It'll just be a shift in, market power from, the government-backed sector with IMBs over to the non-government backed sector in depositories. My sense is, with Basel and all the rest, if you wind up with a government channel shrinking dramatically, it's not clear to me that the non-government channel has a wherewithal these days to lean in and fill that vacuum all that much. I think that pulling the government back too dramatically, at least in housing, would be a pretty damn disruptive transition, as it were.
This is The Big Picture, presented by our friends and sponsors at Depth. I'm Rich Swerbinsky with Onward and Upward Consulting, this week joined by Robbie Chrisman and our special guest, former Obama senior housing policy advisor, Jim Parrott. Jim, the cuts at HUD, those are the ones, there's been some stories, I think more than any of the agencies, where the cuts could have some real world impact to housing and underserved people and things that are going on that HUD is involved in. Any thoughts on the cuts at HUD?
Yeah, so it's been interesting that the initial wave of rumors and then some stuff that was conveyed actually from the administration itself, it sounded like they were going to ring fence FHA and Ginnie. It sounded like they're going to go after the block grant programs and the more community development side of HUD, and leave FHA and Ginnie alone. And so I think a lot of the housing folks were breathing a sigh of relief that while they may not like the fact that the rest of HUD, the UD part of HUD's getting beaten up, at least the H part of HUD's not getting beaten up. It does not seem that that's the case. It seems now that FHA is in the crosshairs too, and Ginnie as well. And so I think that the $64,000 question for housing at least is do they go through with it? Because it could be that as they have identified things they want to cut, and those of us that know a little bit about what FHA does get wind of it and point out that, oh, well, if you shut down the whole, national servicing center in Oklahoma City, like that's not good. And maybe there's a lot that's on the cutting board that has that feel to it, where once we get to weigh in, they back off a little. So first question is, do they actually go through with the level of cuts at FHA and Ginnie that they're sort of kicking around? And then the second question is, are they targeted enough and thoughtful enough about what it is they're cutting, that they can do this without major damage? They're going to do it. If they're cutting 40-50% of FHA and Ginnie, it's going to be a problem at some point. The question is it a little bit of a problem or a lot of a problem? And whether it's a little or a lot of a problem depends on how smart they are in going in and doing the cuts. And part of the problem is, and this is true across a lot of agencies, they don't really have their teams there in place yet. So you've got this weird dynamic where the DOGE folks and the White House folks, who frankly don't know anything about housing, are telling the housing folks, you got to cut 50% of your staff. And the housing folks are all career, folks at HUD. Their answer is, well, no, you really shouldn't cut this. You really shouldn't cut that. And I'm sure the DOGE folks are hearing this all over the place, and they don't really have the smarts about housing to know like what a healthy cut looks like. So you've got this dissonance between the two institutions, where one side really wants to go in and cut everything by half, and the other side that knows something about how all this works is pushing back. At some point, hopefully you're going to end up with Trump folks in HUD that the DOGE people and the OMB people actually trust and respect, who know enough about housing that they can guide all this in a way that doesn't shoot us all collectively in the foot. And whether or not that happens is it may be driven by how quickly they want to move. Like if they really do want to make these cuts in the next whatever month, then they're not going to have their team in place, and inevitably they're going to like saw off a foot by accident. If they're willing to wait a little bit till they get their team in and they get a little intelligence coming out from HUD back to the White House, maybe they can do this in a way that isn't quite so problematic. But it's one of those moments where, like from an industry perspective, being kind of involved with whoever the channels of influence you guys have, NBA or whatever mechanisms you guys have collectively who are watching, it's worth making sure that the guys you're paying to watch your backs are live right now, because this is one of those moments that could be a bit of an inflection point where some really big things could happen in a way that has a lot of downstream consequence that we can't reverse. If they go and fire half of HUD or half of FHA or whatever, and it's like the wrong people, as it were, the people that you need to keep the trains running on time, like they can't unscramble that omelet in 6 months. Like, it's not like we can go back and undo all that damage. Like, we've screwed things up for a long time. So it's important that whoever's got inroads with the administration is able to develop channels where the people that are making these decisions run the decisions by people that actually know these markets and can weigh in on, well, you probably don't want to do that. I can see why you'd want to do that, but that's probably not good either. You should focus over here. Like, we got to give these guys eyes somehow on the market so that what they're doing is well informed.
It's like what you said though about DOGE. Every department they go to cut, whether it's national parks, the EPA, or HUD, it's, hey, whoa, you can't do that. And they're hearing that everywhere, and they're going, sorry,
Yeah.
fight.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it worries me from the sense of the point you made in your response before this last one about, if they're making the government to be so nimble and agile, well, what happens when the Democrats inevitably win control in 4 years or 2 years or 4 years or 6 years or 8 years or whenever? It never, then it swings, and we're in this pendulum type of thing going back and forth. And it's so odd to me. And a part 3-point response that I'd have for you is, Trump wants to gut housing, or he is gutting housing or whatever, and it's so important for America. I'm almost like, are you doing that? And then you're also going to turn to the Fed and say, hey, buy a bunch of mortgage-backed securities to drive
Mhm.
rates down, and we need to blow up our balance sheet so that we can have interest rates at an affordable, like it just seems dissonant. And I appreciate you in a previous answer talking about how, yeah, all these parts are out there and let me kind of weave them together. Because right now, a lot of us are going, is this a cohesive strategy for, and what is the end goal or hope for outcome?
Yeah, I was talking to someone who is pretty close to the Trump administration a few weeks ago, and they had this great uh, analogy or metaphor or whatever. It's a little like someone who's pretty good at chess, but not really good at chess. You kind of can think maybe 4 moves ahead. You're like, all right, you sit at the chessboard and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this. And if they do that, you can do it's like me teaching my 9-year-old in chess. Like we both seem really cool about 4 moves in. And then after that, you're like, all right, well, like now what do I do? And you're kind of winging it. And it takes a different kind of mind to get past that 4 moves into the next 10. It feels like these guys really planned the first 4 moves well. Like they went into it and they're like, all right, we're definitely going to do this and this. And if they do that, and I feel like we're now done with the opening 4 moves. And now we're just
Have you
kind of
seen
like,
the Bart Simpson plays chess where he plays like 4 games at once and people are like, oh my God, look at this guy. And it's like some other guy's like he's losing every single game.
yeah, well, that's kind of, I mean, not to be too overly partisan about the whole thing. There is a worry that they really thought through a couple of objectives, like we really want to shrink the government or we really want to consolidate power. And those are two really complicated things to do, whether one likes them or not. But they might not have had the time or the bandwidth to have integrated in things like, yeah, but we don't want to blow up the housing market, or yeah, but it actually would make sense to keep a big government footprint for market stability reasons or whatever. Like when you begin to layer in those added priorities that maybe aren't high priorities, they're like a level down, then it makes your first 2 steps really a lot harder. It's to your point about going and wanting to cut a bunch of agencies. Like if it's one thing to just say, look, Musk, I just want you to shrink every agency other than the Department of Defense by half. That's your objective. If that's the only objective he's got, in some ways, it's not that hard to do. You're going to break a bunch of stuff, but it doesn't matter. Your only objective is knocking it down in half. If you add into that, okay, I want you to do that, but I don't want you to screw up the housing market, and I want you to worry about interest rates, and I want you to worry about, yada, yada, yada. Well, now the whole thing gets a lot more complicated. So it feels like what's happened is we've gotten through the first couple of moves, and now they're beginning to see, as surely they expected, the difficulties of going much further. And they're going to have to make some tough calls about, all right, well, it's like on the negotiations over tax stuff. It's like watching the Republicans in Congress figure out if you're really going to pay for a $4.5 trillion tax cut or extension of the tax cut, what are you going to cut? And it's all easy to say waste, fraud, and abuse, yada, yada, yada. We've heard that forever. But if anybody that looks at the budget of the government, if you take defense off, and I'm not saying they're going to take all this off, but if you take defense off, you take Medicaid off or healthcare generally off, I mean, there's just not enough. You could shut everything else down and you can't get to $4.5 trillion. Like the math doesn't add up. So at some point, you got the rubber's going to hit the road and you got to make a tough choice about, all right, well, if we really do want to make this deficit neutral, if you want to, pay for a $4.5 trillion extension of a tax cut, you're going to do something about Social Security. You're going to do something about defense. Like at some point, the stuff gets hard, and I think that's the kind of dynamic that the whole cost cutting exercise, agency chopping exercise runs into. Like it all feels good in theory that you're going to shrink them all to 50%. You're going to make it all more White House driven. But I think as they get into the weeds of each of these buildings and come to realize how much the government does, that like nobody should take an issue with, that we kind of, whether you like it or not, need at this point, the whole thing gets a lot harder to do. It's just hard once you realize what each building does to say, go cut it in half.
And, as somebody, I mean, my take on this has been over the years that conservatorship has been working good and it's been insanely profitable for the government. But I have to admit, like, these last 6 months has made me change my tune on it. And listening to all this, like every 4 years, all these massive changes and the politicization of housing and, because Trump's first term, a lot of people forget he gutted the HUD budget. Ben Carson gutted HUD's
Yeah.
budget. It wasn't as highly publicized, but and then the Biden administration came in and kind of built it back up. But isn't this all kind of an argument for maybe government shouldn't be as heavily in housing in America as it is? It's so in it. I mean, since
Yeah.
2008.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's easy to say in theory, get out, but if you were to take a step back, when you say the government, I don't mean you, but when one says the government should pull back, it's important to ask or explain what we mean by pulling back. If you mean shrinking the government footprint, then I go back to how difficult it would be to actually shrink the government footprint, by which I mean shrink the size of the market, the segment of the market in which the government's removing the tail risk from the channel. That's how the GSE channel works. It's how the FHA Ginnie channel works. And so if by shrinking the government's involvement in the housing market, you mean shrinking those two footprints, I think there's a huge downside cost to that. Like I'll give you an example. In the housing crisis, right at the housing crisis, that was the last time the government's footprint's been pretty small. Remember, the PLS market was big. The portfolio market was, bigger than it is now. And so the government share was smaller. Well, when the shit hit the fan and everything went south and policymakers had to figure out how to help people, the people we could not help were those outside the government footprint. We couldn't get into the private contracts among the PLS servicing contracts and whatnot. We couldn't help, but we couldn't do any mods in that space. It was just a complete mess outside the footprint. And so fast forward to the pandemic, shit hits the fan again, and the government had almost the entirety of the market. And we went through the pandemic. Think about how amazing it is that we got through the pandemic the way we did in the housing space without the housing market blowing up. I mean, people couldn't pay their mortgages for like 6 months, and yet the housing market did not blow up. That is only because the government channel was enormous, and we could basically create a forgiveness channel, not forgiveness, a forbearance channel that took pressure off of people that, whose jobs were shut down because the economy was shut down. And that was only because we had a big government footprint, through which we could actually implement policy. Fed, the same thing. The Fed can't help you outside the government footprint. The Fed can only help inside the footprint. Buying up MBS, they're not buying PLS MBS, they're buying agency MBS. So you got to be careful about the shrinking the government footprint piece, because there are a lot of benefits to that. But on the flip side of that, the wild swings in how one thinks about housing ideologically, should give one pause for how partisan you make these agencies. And so there is a question about, to Robbie's point about, if we wind up with a government generally that is in which the power is concentrated into the hands of very few people who share a single view of the world, then we're going to wind up with wild swings in everything, housing, whatever, you name it. And so, when Trump gets run out of, Trump leaves office, and you wind up with, at some point, a Democratic administration, and imagine if it's like a far left Democratic administration. In the current system, because of independent agencies, because of Congress, you've got all these checks on the extremes of a president that slow what that president can possibly do down. They can still do stuff, and they can do some extreme stuff if they've got a sympathetic Congress, but they got dance partners that they got to dance with in order to do what they want to do. If we undergo a transformation of power in the country where one person gets to call all the shots, it's great when you like that person and they're calling shots you want them to call. But at some point, we're gonna have somebody else in there. They're gonna be calling very different shots. We're all gonna be freaking out that they're dragging us all in this other direction. And so, be careful what you wish for, I guess, in any case.
And to bring it full circle, Jim, the GSEs, privatization, I think it's clear that at some point this is going to be a road that the Trump admin, most likely with Bill Pulte leading the charge, is going to go down. Your thoughts on like how likely it is that they privatize the GSEs? Can they do it without Congress? Timeline? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So they are absolutely going to make a run at this. That is, you'll see over the next 2 years at some point more public-facing talk about this from them. My guess is it doesn't. It's not as fast out of the gate as I think we initially assumed. Pulte, in choosing Pulte, they didn't choose like an M&A, deal maker type that could pull this off in the next 6 months. He doesn't have a whole lot of experience in the mortgage space. Bessent said pretty clearly that he doesn't see this as a near-term priority. And obviously they got some other fish to fry between tariffs and the tax negotiations and reconciliation, all that. So this feels like, they may get up and running on this in a year or so, and maybe they get real traction in 2 years, because in a year we get into midterm, so there's some like political map they got to worry about. I'm pretty confident they'll get far down this road. I'm pretty confident that the GSEs will continue to build capital. I'm pretty confident that Pulte will grab the playbook that's sitting in a banker's box that has Calabria's name on it, that he duct tapes when he left, last time around. He'll open that back up and pick up where Calabria left off, which will mean hiring some investment banks to give advice about a capital raise and doing the legal work needed to get the regulatory structure right. Like, I think that'll all, keep going. I'm pretty skeptical that they ultimately pull the trigger, though. And there are a whole bunch of reasons, and I won't go too far into the weeds, but I'll give you a couple at least to give everybody a sense of the difficulty involved. One, the taxpayers got a $334 billion stake in the GSEs right now. The senior preferred position is a third of $1 trillion. They've also got warrants and common equity, 79.9% of the common equity, so they could pull the trigger and own the companies tomorrow, even out of conservatorship. None of that works in a post-conservatorship world. You can't go raise private capital in a world in which the government has a third of $1 trillion stake in your company, right? So they got to sort that out. And the shareholder types, the guys that really want to see recap and release happen, like Bill Ackman, these guys, step one in their deck is always, we'll just get out a giant eraser and we're just going to erase that $334 billion obligation to the taxpayer. Like, and I mean, maybe Trump's got the guts to do that, but it seems like it's a politically problematic move to make, to just erase a 330 some trillion dollar obligation to the taxpayer. But they got to figure out how to deal with that, and the outcome would be politically problematic. So that's problem one. Problem two, which I actually think is a bigger problem, that doesn't get much credit. They've got to figure out where the government support of the GSC stops. So right now in conservatorship, they've got these lines of credit to the GSEs, hundreds of billions of dollars of credit, line of credit to the GSEs. But the question is going to be, when they're released, does the market believe that if they blow through those lines of credit, the government will step back and bail them out? So that's what they call the implicit guarantee. So before the conservatorship, the market universally believed that they had the implicit guarantee, and that if Fannie and Freddie blew through their capital and blew through their much smaller lines of credit to the Treasury, which they had then too, that the government would bail them out. And because of that, they had a good rating, AAA sort of investment grade, Treasury debt-like rating. The Fed felt comfortable buying their MBS. Like, a lot of good stuff came with that. Cost of capital was low. All these sovereign investors that are nervous about investing in credit risk, MBS investors nervous about investing in credit risk, didn't have to worry about it because they were pretty confident the government was going to step in and clean things up if things went south. So like, the whole model kind of depended on this implicit guarantee notion. And so what they're going to have to deal with is, when you're spinning them back out, that whole same cast of characters is going to say, all right, well, it's really great you've got this giant line of credit to Treasury, but tell me what happens when you blow through that line at some point, because it's a finite line. Like, they can't make it go higher. So when in 10 years, 15 years, you go through several recessions and they eat into that line of credit, and they get down to like the last $5 billion, and the rating agencies and the Taiwanese investors, the Japanese investors, the guys who are most sensitive about this sort of tail risk, say, all right, well, you guys, like, is the government still in on this or not? Are you guys backing this or not? And the problem for the Trump guys, it wouldn't have been a problem for the Biden guys, but the problem for the Trump guys is Republicans have been scathing in their criticism about the implicit guarantee. They were scathing about it before the conservatorship. They've been scathing about it in the conservatorship. So there's going to be this really strong pressure on Trump to say, no implicit guarantee. If they need to be bailed out again, the taxpayers are not picking the dime up. It's not going to be on the taxpayers' dime. It's going to be on the shareholders, the creditors' dimes. You got to fend for yourselves. If they say that, the rating agencies downgrade. A lot of these risk-sensitive MBS investors are like, man, I can't even calculate the cost of this credit risk. I'm out. It's not clear the Fed can buy the MBS anymore. So the whole model begins to teeter a little bit. And so the reason why I think that may be an existential problem to them, this administration getting them out, is the politics of writing down the taxpayer's asset, really problematic. The politics of defining where the government's support of the GSEs ends, super problematic. So I think those two things alone, when you're sitting in the Roosevelt room explaining to Trump what you want to do, you don't have good answers to that, are problematic. And then he's going to ask at some point, some political person is going to ask, well, this is all great. Fannie Freddie gets out. My pal John Paulson will be happy. My new pal Bill Ackman will be happy. What's it going to do to mortgage rates? And then they say, well, kind of depends. It's going to be like, I don't know, a 30 basis point problem or maybe a 150 basis point problem if we do this poorly. He'll be like, wait, why are we doing this again? And this is like coming at the end of his term and all that. And I don't know. So it feels to me like the politics of this are fraught, and the politics for his base. I mean, who the hell in his base knows what Fannie and Freddie are? Like, what political box do you check if you're Trump, if you take all this risk by blowing Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship, when like the man on the street's like, wait, you blew my mortgage rates up by 50 basis points, like for what exactly? Explain this to me again. So anyway, I'm skeptical they pull this off. That's not to say it's a zero probability thing. It's definitely not that. We've seen they're willing to take some risk with market disruption, but I'm skeptical.
Well, great stuff. That was outstanding, Jim. And yeah, thank you so much for going through all that and kind of taking us through all the machinations of not quite as easy, right? It's, just release them from conservatorship, a lot of moving parts to it. You wrote a great piece with Mark Zandi a month or two ago talking about the implicit guarantee specifically. That's such a big part of this, right? And it is just a huge part of a potential recap and release or not for the GSEs. And yeah, we'll continue to track it here on the big picture. And Jim, hopefully we can have you back to help us make sense of it as you did so ably today.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I want to thank our attendees for spending part of your Thursday afternoon with us. We're live on Zoom every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Then is where most of you listen, it goes immediately to podcasts and a couple different YouTube channels. And I want to thank Robbie. Robbie, thanks for joining us today. And thanks to our guest, Jim Parrott. And thanks to our guest that joined us. And we'll see you next Thursday on the Big Picture.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Have a great Friday and weekend, everyone. Take care. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Robbie.
Appreciate it.